Thank you for joining us today for the conversation between Gabrielle Goliath and Maneo Mohale in collaboration with the Center for the Study of Race, Gender and Class at UJ. As many of you know, Goodman Gallery was founded in apartheid South Africa in 1966 and was one of the only spaces for artists of all races to exhibit their work. It has provided a place for shared humanity, a spirit of togetherness, a space for listening, learning, and growth as part of its 57-year commitment to social justice for all. Goodman Gallery is delighted to present Beloved, an exhibition of new work by Gabrielle Goliath. Beloved, or as Christina Sharp phrases it, with characteristic poise, be loved. In this ongoing and very personal series of drawings and prints, the artist summons and celebrates a chorus of both radical and femme presences, poets, priestesses, activists, artists, parents, and prodigies. Beloved is an ode, a work of the heart, a labor of recognition, thanks, and love. Thank you both for being so open to sharing your thoughts today. We look forward to the conversation.
Everyone, thank you so much for gathering with us today. My name is Danny Bola, and I'm the curator at the Center for the Study of Race, Gender, and Class. This convening and this gathering takes place as part of our Global Blackness Summer School. Launched in 2021, the RGC Global Blackness Summer School is an annual hybrid gathering that takes place in the summer months of the Southern Hemisphere, a place for collective exploration and experimentation. This year's summer school has been made possible by funding from the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences and the University of Johannesburg. We use the term global blackness to attend to the ways in which black life exists across the globe, but is not always the same experience. This year's school our theme title is For Wholeness on Black Being Well, celebrating practices of creativity, repair, and well-being that refuse co-option. Our hope is to collectively re-envision liberatory projects on terms that do not presuppose the abnegation of black joy as the weighty cost of our freedom, nor the perennial deferment of blackness as living with or as possibility. As self-care industries recycle whiteness as wellness and global responses to a planet in crisis routinely disavow historical imperatives of repair and reparation, we ask, how can we language grammars and practices of being otherwise? How do we perform the world differently now, refusing the binarization of modernity, progress, and the subject man? What does it mean to work collectively and hopefully as we strive towards whole, if not always well, selves? It is an honor to introduce two artists whose practices and work I so deeply admire and am in deep gratitude to commune with. Gabrielle Goliath and Maneo Mohale's practices think with beauty, encounter, and witnessing as they sound and invoke a black feminist chorus and community through presence and through citation in ways that Christina Sharp thinks of as beauty as a method. Through the ritual, sonic, and social encounters of her art practice, Gabrielle Goliath attends and tends to histories and present-day conditions of differentially valued life, reaffirming the ways in which brown, black, femme, and queer practices of possibility perform the world differently. Each of her works convenes a coming to, a tenuous community, collapsing the presumed, remove, and privileged subject position of representation as white, male, and heteronormative, calling for meetings in and across difference on terms of complicity, relation, and love. Goliath's immersive, often durational installations have shown across South Africa and internationally. She has won several awards, including a Future Generation Art Prize, Special Prize in 2019, the Standard Bank Young Artist Award in 2019, and the Institut Français Afrique en Créations Prize at the Bamako Biennale in 2017. Her work features in numerous public and private collections, including Kunsthalle Zurich, Tate, Modern, Iziko South African National Gallery, Joburg Art Gallery, and Wits Art Museum. Maneo Mohale is a South African poet, feminist writer, and editor. Their work has appeared in various publications, including Jalada, Proofrock, the Johannesburg Review of Books, the Mail and Guardian, and Spectrum. They've served as a contributing editor at ID, among other publications. They were Bitch Media's first Global Feminism Writing Fellow in their inaugural 2016 class, where they wrote on race, media, sexuality, and survivorship. They've been longlisted twice for the Sol Plaatje European Union Poetry Anthology Award, and their debut collection of poetry, Everything is a Deathly Flower, was published by Uhlanga in September 2019. The collection was shortlisted for the Ingrid Jonker Poetry Prize, later winning the 2020 Glenna Luche Prize for African Poetry. Please welcome Gabrielle and Maneo.
Yes. It's so wonderful to see such a gorgeous room of Saturday people gathered in just a beautiful arty space. I feel very, very grateful to be sitting across from my beloved, Gabrielle Goliath. I think before we even begin, because whoa, everything, I think it would be wonderful just to invite everyone to take a few grounding breaths with me. I know I need them, but let's take 3 ones before we even begin as a way just to ground ourselves in the space and remind ourselves that we are flesh bags full of breath and blood and wondrous possibility. So let's do it. Okay, first one. In through the nose. And out. One more. And out. One more. And out. A really beautiful way of grounding myself, and I think grounding this conversation. We promised you poetry, so I'd love to open up with another one of my beloveds, an incredible queer Palestinian poet called George Abraham. They use they, he pronouns. I use they, them, mostly for them. And I'd like to read a poem called The Autobiography of Spring. I think we find ourselves in a budding moment, as much as there's so much destruction that we are witnessing that feels deeply ancient in itself, a modern destruction, but an ancient one too. It's a really grounding way. Flowers are really grounding for me, and in George's work, I find them in abundance. So this is Autobiography of Spring by George Abraham. At the center of myself is a wilderness. At the center of my wilderness is the self I spawned from. Hear me out. There was never a beginning or end, only resentment, which rooted, curdled so far into the earth of me. What else could it do but blossom an unfathomable want? Unspool 1,000 symmetries, magnolia's plume, flowers elder, oak's thick-veined mall. If you cut me open, you could know my entire history. How at the heart of everything is a seam, a rupture. How at the center of every azalea is a seed, carrying another self, which, presuming we get this far, may spring so vast it becomes a home to small-winged wanderers, who, when hearing the hum of their own echo, may tremble, may sting. I think why I chose George to kind of start us off in this conversation is this enunciation of at the heart of everything. And I feel like this incredible heartening body of work of yours feels like your own heart on display. And a way to get into that, I suppose, or a way to kind of ask about it, is around process. You started, when we had our own little conversation, something that I was really struck by is that you said that mark making for you is a way of relinquishing control, or relinquishing control of the hand's authority. So tell me a little bit about the process. How did this body of work come to be?
Thank you, Maneo. It's such an honor to gather with you, whom I hold in high regard, and to gather with all of you today. I am going to preface our discussion on process by way of a sort of meandering insight and point of departure from an existing work of mine called These Three Remain. It's not shown anywhere else outside of Sharjah at the Biennale there. I'm incredibly preoccupied with love. It's the first iteration of my love trilogy, as I call it. And so I think to really get to the heart of what Maneo is asking, the heart of the heart, I shall begin with love. So love remains in the wound, in survival, in spite of, oh, I've lost my, okay, I'll begin again. Can you hear me? So love remains in the wound, in survival, in spite of, in the cracks and crevices and dust motes, in dancing, laughing, crying, being still, in the music. So that's the heart. So we'll begin, yes, we'll dive straight into Beloved and the process and some of the discussion that Maneo and I had when we met. So drawing and painting and the autographic mark has always been an incredibly significant aspect of my praxis. It's something that I have sustained throughout. Many people express surprise at that. They're mostly accustomed to music or sound or performance or durational, larger scale pieces, but in actual fact, drawing and painting is a really important part of my praxis. The process of it, the materiality of it, and the very embodiment and enactment of doing it is also incredibly key to my whole praxis. And so I want to first speak about this notion of mark making as a means of being close, which is something I took Maneo through when I was really, for me, and if you come to my home, you will encounter many drawings that I've done. A drawing that I did many years ago of Ipeleng Christine Mohalani, who was the first individual that I commemorated with a work of mine, a long-term durational performance piece called Elegy. That was a work I did in 2015. And Elegy is a lament. It's a work of mourning, and it is performed in memory of a different person every time it is enacted. But in doing this drawing of Ipeleng, it became aware, and it's quite a different drawing to the drawings you encounter in Beloved. It is an intensive, labored, very particular, granular drawing. And I spent probably well over a month on that drawing. And it became a way for me of remaining close, being close, coming to a form of relation and encounter. This is really important, these ideas. They're not just nice-sounding words for me, this idea of relation, of encounter, of being close. Because, and this is where Maneo and I will take this discussion, is that how does one commune in relation to one another in a world of others that really refuses the sort of sanctioned genius of the male artist who works from a remove and distance. And I refuse that even in the physicality of the way in which I work. I work on the floor. I work really close to these drawings. I relinquish the control of the hand. It's not about the precious fidelity of the mark. It's about, I mean, I loved how my beloved James said it this morning. It's about relinquishing to the miraculous as well. What comes of that moment? And so the process of producing these works, of making these works, of being so preoccupied and sitting really closely with this notion of love, it really becomes manifest through process and the materiality of making this work.
Yeah. I really love that. I think I love the image of you deeply embodied, sketching these faces into being, but with your whole body, and that you were saying that you use these thick, fat sort of like ways of moving and tools. And in listening to you now and talking around the miraculous, I think that there's something really beautiful that seems also organic and natural, and also so a gorgeous thread throughout your entire work. But by getting into process about relinquishing control of the hand's authority and by just opening that up, we're kind of collapsing all authorship, and which in itself is quite masculinist. And I think in so many of the ways that we're thinking about crisis and urgency at the moment are in these deeply masculinist, incredibly militarized, even on the level of the body, even on the level of the individual. So to start and to speak about this work as a way of being close and as a way of practicing love as a miracle, which feels really beautiful and also like wildly poetic to me, but poetic in a way that feels true. Poetic in a way that feels true in looking at the world right now. Cool. I guess instead of just sort of like hovering above them, I really want to talk about each one. Or a selection of a few. And because both of us have had the privilege of being in close community, however virtual, with the incredible thinker Christina Sharp, I think I want to start with Christina. So tell me a little bit about Christina and beauty as a method, and why. And it's also wonderful to see Christina Sharp's book Ordinary Notes just sitting over there, and also Toni Morrison's Beloved, and also like this is all very honest. I love it. I feel watched over and guided. So tell me a little bit about your relationship with Christina Sharp.
Yeah, it's a very special one. And I have had the privilege, as you say, of not only engaging with her by way of her writing, but actually in person. But I'll go back to elegy, which is at the heart of so much of what I do and an incredibly important work to me. So when I first started producing elegy in 2015, which is, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a work that has the capacity to unmake you. It takes the form of a lament every time it is performed. 7 classically trained singers sound and sustain a single note for 1 hour. And every single time it's performed and directed towards a specific woman or non-gender conforming individual who's been subjected to fatal acts of sexualized, racialized violence in South Africa. There were also, in actual fact, 2 performances in which I collaborated with another dear friend and historian, Dr. Sarah Jappi, who came and spoke with me about really thinking about this continuum of violence, not only as a contemporary phenomenon that's popped out of nowhere in the middle of South Africa, but in actual fact the conditions are there, and how do we begin to think of the aftermaths of the social catastrophes of slavery, of colonialism, of apartheid that we all inhabit, each and every single one of us. And in those instances, she did the speculative work of finding these 2 incidents of 2 enslaved women who had been subjected to such fatal acts. And so in making a work like elegy, and what really, so much of what prompted it was really contending with what is terribly ordinary, normative, and quotidian, and that is the culture of femicide and rape culture in South Africa. I was really grappling with how does one even begin to contend with this. And I think one thing I was incredibly keenly aware of is that I did not want to, as Hartman might say, I did not want to return to the scene of subjection. I did not want to repeat the violence. But how was I going to do a work that didn't leave by the wayside those lost to us? How? Because for me, when I think of a world otherwise, in which there's no such thing as disposable, expendable lives, it is about carrying those losses with us. And so I was really thinking very carefully around how do I do this? How do I come to these incredibly difficult and fraught, unspeakable experiences, but in ways that, as I say, not about vicarious trauma, not about perpetuating the violence, but coming in the wake. I used to use this term, I used to use this phrase, and then I came to Christina's work, because I was always arguing for and I still do, I say, really, anyone who thinks my work is about violence, then they really need to think a bit more deeply, dive a bit more deeply, because it's not. And I was, with the work like Energy, I was saying, it's about something that comes in the wake. How do we contend with these aftermaths? How do we do a different kind of work? And for me, partly Elegy, in doing that, is about not approaching faceless, anonymous statistics, but not faces, but named, lovable, grievable individuals. Each time Elegy happened, I spoke with a close family member or friend who scripted a eulogistic text. So, and that for me was also important because it was about collapsing that remove. So the same way that I draw very closely, it was also about, I don't just drop into Rwanda and make a work about the genocide and parachute out again. I get to know a family member or friend. I speak to them about the work. I ask them for their blessing and their consent to do this work and then do it. And so Christina's work was this extraordinary revelation. It was magisterial. I came to it and as I said, it really began to give me a vocabulary for thinking about dealing with the wake and the aftermath, and not just as a site of utter negation, but of hope and possibility and joy as well. And so that's the sort of real significance of someone like Christina by way of her extraordinary scholarly work. And then, of course, having had the privilege of meeting her in person here in South Africa, of course, also by way of the wonderful work that the center is doing when they'd arranged for Thinking Black. No, I've got the name wrong. It's a Black lexicon. Okay, sorry, I'm sorry. But having the opportunity to gather with Christina in person and speak with her about my work, but then, of course, in that moment, she got to encounter Elegy. And she was undone by Elegy. I mean, she spoke of it afterwards. She cried. It made her think very much of her mother. And if you know her work, you know her mother means an enormous amount to her. And then, of course, cited and invoked Toni Morrison, beloved, invoked Toni, who said that that was the sound that broke the back of words. So that's initiated this beautiful conversation between us. And she is wanting to write about my work and think alongside each other. So that's extraordinary and really special when things go beyond I suppose, just the remote act of reading, but when we actually start to commune. But in the practice of citation, as there's something also deeply citational about Beloved that leans into community, I do have moments of citation myself that I want to introduce as a kind of poetic but also discursive interlude as we speak today. So I'm going to cite Christina. And this is from a text of hers called Monstrous Intimacies. So I think it's important that in doing this work of Black feminist invocation, we recognize whiteness as a normative governing order of knowledge, language, life, something she describes as a political project, a logic by which I mean it is a calculus, a way of sorting oneself and others into categories of who must be protected and those who are or will soon be expendable. And of course, I think this resonates profoundly in this desperate context of grief and woe, as we witness the indiscriminate bombing of civilians in Gaza, and this in the wake of the attacks by Hamas on Israeli civilian lives on October 7th. And it's also really important for me to think about this. As I said, I'm really thinking of a long continuum, and thinking of violence and trauma is not only singular and spectacular, but as I said, ordinary, insidious, ongoing. And so for me, it's also really important to then think of that in relation to the mass displacement, ongoing displacement and loss of life in other parts of the world, like the DRC and Sudan, and more. I don't say that at the exclusion of other sites of social and humanitarian catastrophe. But of course, also being as someone sitting here and enunciating myself from the site of Johannesburg, South Africa, and of course, my own work is also thinking about this very much closely in relation to, as I said, the normative endemic violence of rape culture and femicide. So, as you can tell, it's very important work. Really thinking of the normative conditions of queerphobia, transphobia, Afrophobia. So Christina, like others, like this chorus that I join in and alongside, is so important to my praxis.
I'm thinking about my own encounter with elegy and how that was one of the first ways I was able to contextualize my own work. As a survivor of sexual violence, a survivor of queer sexual violence, I'm really concerned with empire. I remember in the early days of trying to write my book and trying to grapple with what poetry can do, if it can do anything, and looking for texts and looking for artists and looking for art and looking for anchors to ground my thinking. It was important for me to zoom out of myself, perhaps as a way to escape my own pain, perhaps as a way of also dissociating from my own body, but also as a way to perhaps also like intellectualize my own suffering. But in the wake of so much violence enacted upon my own body, it was really important for me to link it and hook it up to empire, and hook it up to, again, not just these giant, spectacular eruptions of violence, but legacies of violence. Not just enactments of violence on singular bodies, but again, just inheritances of violence that have at their root colonialism and exploitation, whiteness, and European apathy deeply at their heart. So it was hard for me to locate myself inside of that until I saw elegy. I remember the feeling also in my body, because it was just extraordinary to see a group of femmes sustain each other. That you talk about this sustaining of a singular note, but what I saw was just a giant work of just continued enunciation into silence. And so much of my work, or what I attempted and what I learned from you, continue to learn from you, is how to represent violence without reproducing it. And I remember at 10 Queer sitting in your studio when you gave us a really beautiful talk, I was here, my eyes were open. And I had never heard anyone say it like that. I didn't even know that one could represent violence and think about tenderness and care from the beginning. So it's wonderful to hear that you have that you went looking and you found Christina's work. without seemingly also stumbling upon it because you've been speaking about the wake so much. So thank you for also contextualizing that piece, not just in this new stuff, but just what you've always been thinking about. If you can allow me to kind of move on to the next person, I really want to talk about, since we're talking about femness and sustaining through community, I want to talk about Winnie, beloved, and such an iconographic approach to someone who in themselves has been made into an icon, and perhaps the processes with which that's happened aren't always careful, aren't always tender. I'm thinking about the renaming of William Nicol into Winnie Madikizela Drive, I think now it's called. And perhaps contrasting it with your portrait of Winnie. And for me, what I encountered in looking at the portraits and what your representation of Winnie means for me, it feels like a space for rage, a space for femme rage specifically, not just as an emblematic, tokenistic, decorative consequence of feeling or like a residue of feeling. I feel like by including Winnie in this body of work, you're asking us to think about national history. You're asking us to think about nationhood and identity. So can you talk to me a little bit about Mum Winnie?
Yeah. That portrait means the world to me. Very hard to part with. But I think that perhaps a note in portraiture as we're talking about Winnie, because we find ourselves in this intractable political moment. The figure of Winnie is such a polarizing figure. So many people presumed to be able to sum up this person. And I think, as I said, a note on this notion of portraiture. And for me, and I think this is something that Beloved really counters, it's not, this is something Maneo and I talk about often, the masculinist register of, be it protest, activism, art practice, representation, and so forth. But in really thinking that Beloved is not a heroic exercise in portraiture. It's not about valorizing anybody. If anything, it is a summoning of beloveds, they themselves human, skin. I met this incredible journalist who's really battling in their work as somebody of Pakistani origin in Norway, and how they face persecution from all sides, from Norway, from their own communities and so forth. And I was so incredibly affected by what she said when she said in this moment, she said, I also have skin. And that really makes me think of somebody like Winnie. So I think, an important note on this, on portraiture. We also spoke, and maybe I'll touch on it a little bit, because Maneo and I were talking about what happens in using Winnie's name in that way, and what are the differences in the different spaces, and I think it is that closeness and relationality. It's the chorus as well of Beloved. It's the scale. Maneo pointed this out so magnificently in saying, what makes that a potentially hollow gesture using her name, and how those differences register and arise between the two different forms of representing Winnie. But I think, and I really want to pick up on this frame of rage. So on the one hand, I'm open to really being very expansive and open to thinking about certain experiences and feelings. And as we were saying, say something like activism, for example. But I think for me, often when I do think of the frame of rage, the kind of immediate associations that come to mind is rage. The excessive, constantly spilling, what we encounter in the most everyday moments, rage. And I think I'm beginning to wonder, because for me, what is really interesting with Winnie Madikizela Mandela's portrait specifically is I find it very vulnerable. I find there's such a, it's magisterial, but there's a resignation when I look at her, and I wonder if there's a sort of revealing that happens in the I have skin. I feel. I have also, in all of the difficulty of this, I've also been. It's remained on my skin, those imprints, and because we had an opening. A sort of private opening, and there I also invoked these different presences. And I want to repeat the citation of Winnie's that I spoke out that night. And she said, "There is nothing the government has not done to me. There isn't any pain I haven't known." So I think, if anything, in thinking about this idea of, as I said, rage spilling into the everyday, I'm wondering how we can begin to think of allow me to say no. I'm going to read myself now. Not a no to rage, but to rage as past, present, future, our totality. This is not to deny or repress it, because as I say, I mean, there's also no such thing as right or wrong. But to say that we may need to bear our rage, and I think Christina is also someone I'd look to hear when she speaks of grace, to bear our rage, allow it to be transformed into the possibility of something else. And I think I'm really thinking about that because I sometimes really battle with the world. And if it is that just violence begets violence, then rage in a certain frame begets rage. And I think we need to think about that. And I think the figure of Winnie in all of her exquisite complexity and beauty helps us to think about that.
I think I enjoy how my understanding of rage differs from you, and I think stands apart, perhaps because as someone who has been raised inside of registers that are inflected by a particular kind of religious dominance. All the women in my family are Jehovah's Witnesses. And I'm as queer as they come. So I think rage has been relatively new for me, and rage in relation to anger as a kind of amplification and a deepening of anger, and thinking about my own anger as the way that it lives inside of my body, as the part of myself that knows that I deserve love. The part of me that says, ouch, when I've been hurt. The part of me that says also that I have a right to stand up and also say no. And to say no in rage, as an oppositional rage. The text that I draw from and that I mentioned when we had a conversation is a book that draws quite heavily from Fanon, but is by an indigenous Dene theorist and critical race theorist called Glenn Coulthard, and he wrote a book called Red Skin, White Mask, as a way of expressing what he calls righteous rage against reconciliation processes that have been co-opted by governments, as a way of pacifying rage. And rage's revolutionary potential, militant potential. And I think what's been a challenge for me in these times is how to think about militancy as a femme. Militancy against masculinist registers, but one that honors rage. And I look to figures like Mamwini, who expressed rage in such a way that opened up possibility for justice. And I love that invocation. And I love this difference. I love this tension between us. I think it's really generous. And also, I think it's deeply generative. Why? You're fine. You can't get rid of me that easy. Oh yeah, it seems like we have others over. We've got lots of space in the front, friends. And on the sofa. Please come inside. Batung, we don't bite. We just nibble. As a way of, I guess, moving us, now we have some momentum. We're nice and warm now. As a pivot, what a lot of the time people offer beauty as a frivolous thing.
Yeah.
As a narcissistic, individualistic thing. And also like, especially black femme beauty as something accidental or rare or exceptionalized, that there are only certain black women that are really beautiful, or certain, but so I think I'm really interested in your inclusion of a figure like Alec in this work. So tell me about Alec, and then also tell me about beauty, but beauty as perhaps, as Christina Sharp, I don't even know. Like, there's so many ways to approach beauty, but I think the way that I'm thinking about it is from Saidiya Hartman, as what we do, and how we navigate spaces of enclosure. So yeah, tell me about beauty, but beauty as beauty in the face, I suppose, that you don't shy away from, that you don't shrink away from, and that you don't trivialize at all.
Yeah. And yes, I mean, those registers of beauty and sensuality and the erotics of some of the figures in this work are also really important. But, okay, Alec. But so first, okay, so maybe, I mean, one thing I've not really touched on is how personal Beloved is to me, in the sense that it summons these figures who have been significant to me and continue to be, and as I say, that I continue to work and think alongside. And before I studied art, I studied fashion. And
it shows.
Yeah. And I think only Maneo knows how to make me blush, but anyway.
Sorry. You just look so good. I had to just bring that. We're talking about beauty in the abstract, and here you are beautiful in front of me. So how can I leave that alone? I can't. Sorry, I'll give you a moment. I'll stop. I'm sorry. And we were in the middle of talking about your portrait of Alec. So yeah. I want to hear some more.
And no better place to start when speaking about beauty. But yes, I was giving some context to the significance of Beloved. It's a summoning. It's a summoning of all these people who are so important to me. And as a fashion student, before I studied art, and as my clothing became increasingly more unwearable, unlike art objects, I then transitioned into art. But anyway, when I was a fashion student, and I think it was a revelation coming to Alec. And those are the days when one would go and hang out in the bookstores in CNA with all the magazines. I don't know if anyone shares that with me. Not everyone. But or in the aisle of the grocery store. And there she was. And of course, yes, when one is thinking of the politics of beauty, and thinking very much, that would have been a time of so many firsts for someone like Alec Wick, the first African model to do this and do that. And of course, those things are meaningful and are significant, but we still hold to these incredibly boring normative beauty ideals, which we just do. And I don't know what it's going to take to break them. But someone like Alec Wick is magnificent and beautiful, and was not the first beautiful black woman. And was just somebody, as I said, that was a guiding light. And as I said, I think in terms of thinking of beauty, it's really, I'm not trying to sound trite, it's not just about surface level beauty in the instance of someone like Alec, but it is in really thinking of what is the kind of radical possibility that's made possible by this figure, and in their ongoing work, and in their presencing, and so forth. So yes, Alec is just also really personally very important to me. And as I said, it's not about, I mean, this is not an exercise in portraiture that's about valorizing anyone, but there is also a measure of celebration as well of someone like that.
When we got together to have a conversation about how to map this conversation and this sort of exploration of your work, I remember you saying something about a leaking of subjectivity, that you wanted subjects or the subjects that you have chosen also just to leak into one another. Could you say a little bit more about that?
I was citing you, Maneo.
Oh, fine.
No, well, when we were talking, and then so Maneo invoked and summoned Habiba Badaroon. And what did you say? The leaking of
Meaning. Yeah, Habiba was the first, or one of the first poets who, I use the word infected, and I think I use it deliberately because I want to open it up a little, but infected my practice with a sense of water, of fluidity, of liquidness. And she, Habiba talks about a leaking of meaning.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I was talking about.
And I was very struck by that. And then, of course, we were talking about, because Maneo kept saying, why beloved? Why these beloveds? Why not other beloveds? And I think it was thinking about, I then cited you and Habiba by way of you, in thinking of leaky subjectivity. And by that I mean, to return to what I was saying earlier on, this is not a heroic project in eternally memorializing these great people. They're leaky, they have skin, they're imperfect, and they're perfect, and they are all of the in-between, the world between all of those sort of archetypes which we can resort to. This is the hero, this is a villain, but what about the massive, vast expanse between those two frames? And I think for me, in the summoning of these important individuals in a work like Beloved, and you're seeing just a small excerpt of a very large body of work, just so you know. It's I'm quite dedicated to my practice. It's often quite deep, quite labor-intensive, quite discursive. It's ongoing. A work like Beloved is durational, and so will end when I pass my last breath. But it is really thinking about how we summon these leaky subjectivities. And by that I mean, of course, none of us are fixed. We're greater than the sum of our intersectional parts, as I often say. And I think that's what draws me to them, repels me sometimes, surprises me, and more, as I say.
I think you were mentioning just now, but I really want us to get into the conversation around eros and sensuality and queerness and a perfect portrait and person to talk about, the sexy sonic. I think what I'm calling the queer sonic African sublime is Desire Maria. God, and it's hard for me to talk about desire, you know? It's so hard for me to talk about desire. And like, in the twin meanings of those things, it's hard for me to talk about desire, the person, and it's hard for me to also talk about desire. And desire, I feel, is like one of those figures that really asks us to think about eros, really asks us to think about the sensate, the sensational, to think about senses, and the sonic. And I know that Desire is not necessarily the only musician that you not valorize, that you think about and that you represent. Sade is up there as well. So I think perhaps this is a really lovely interlude to start thinking about, sexy Sade and sexy Desire. Because it's hard. Like, it's hard for me to talk about any of them and me not blush. So please, like, save me. Please save me here.
So it's so funny because I think I'm not on Twitter, but I'm sure the last post I saw of Desires was something about exercising their beauties in the gym, and they are all about
always topless
beauty,
too.
right? Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Yes. So Desire. So Desire, and I do want to pick up on your queer African sonic sublime. And to give context, once again, these are people, some of these people I know. So Desire, I collaborated with on a body of work called This Song Is For. And I worked very closely with women and gender-led musical ensembles to produce this work. And in collaboration, we produced cover versions of dedication songs that had all been selected by survivors of rape. And to produce Fight Song, I worked very closely with Desire and the Izikamadi Choir. And I don't know if any of you have experienced the Songs For. I cannot tell you the kind of technical, virtuosic toll it has on those musicians who have to perform these. It's a gargantuan work. What the musicians put into that work is something I will be eternally grateful for. It is just something else. The labor enacted. But anyway, so working with Desire and Izikamadi, and having met Desire, I was so struck by the beauty and grace of this person. Gentle in their speech, and yet sort of unable to contain themselves because there's just something so magnificent about them. We filmed that particular song at the St. Francis Anglican Church. Now, I mention this because there was something pretty divine about the encounter, about the performance. And in thinking about this sonic, African queer sonic sublime, I think it really came about in this repetition is a very key poetic, aesthetic strategy in This Song Is For. And Desire and Izikamadi, they insisted, now just doing one performance, one single shot in This Song Is For is gutting. They insisted on doing it again, and again, and again, and again, to the point where the Friday youth were about to start meeting at the church, and I was saying, we got to get out of the church. And this was because of Desire's black brilliance and virtuosity, and rigor and brilliance and commitment, because each and every single musician that came to that work sat with the words of the survivor to whom they were directing their performance. And it was so meaningful to Desire and Izikamadi. It meant so much to them. And I think for me, I was struck. I mean, I know we're returning and circling back to beauty now, and I think beauty is key in this consideration, but I was so struck by and continue to be awed by the beauty and the grace of Desire and their commitment to do it again and again and again because of their commitment to that virtuosity.
They're also a consummate musician, and what I was trying to invoke in talking about the sublime is this thing of spirit. Desire being an initiated sangoma is also not a footnote.
No.
I think that so much of their spiritual power is ancestral, is linked to bloodlines. And I mean, they're on tour in Europe at the moment, and I'm hearing stories of wild stories of just people of having incredible experiences in the audience, especially South Africans who are in Europe, who are trying to find any touchstone to their people. And it's not just a really gorgeous, sexy nighted groove. It's also, and perhaps not also, it's centrally a deeply spiritual experience, which is what I was saying about the sublime. I think the sense of the sublime is also something that I chase in my own work, but I think in seeing the clear instances and connections that are happening now between contemporary queer artists and ancestral work, deep ancestral work, feels like we're entering into a really different moment for black artists at the moment, and I love seeing it. Do you want to talk to me a little bit about Sade before we move on to Habiba?
Yes. So Sade, I'll summon my mother, who's there, Charmaine Francis. Music was a very important part of the fabric of our home. And even now when people ask me, when did you become an artist? And I've begun to say from the day I began to breathe. Because I'm starting to think about what does it mean to be an artist and make art outside of the academy, of the institution. So music, as I say, was something it's with me always. And was in our home always, but it was quite distinctly within the various camps within the home. So my father had his music, my mother had her music, my two brothers had their music, and of course there was bleed and overlap and so forth. But I always very strongly associated Sade with my mother, and I thought of it as her music. And so, and I'll circle back to this idea of starting to think of when did I become an artist and when did I start to make art and practice art and think and do praxis. I think of it in the act of being in the music. I think of it I would go and seek my mother out, who was seeking out solitude. She would read in the bathroom. And I would find her and disrupt her solitude. I was about 3 years old at the time, and insist that she let me read, and that I then read to her, and so disrupted her moments of solitude. But was always thinking about, and I continue to think about how those were these otherworlding practices, and I think in the heart of the rapture, the heart of the seam, the heart of the difficulty, the heart of love, in the wound. In that moment, how music and reading offered that. And even today, if I just hear Sade's voice, it's so moving and transporting for me. It's so magnificent. But yes, to continue in the practice of citation, I'm going to summon and invoke Sade. Maneo's confused all my notes.
Sorry.
In true style, broke out of our map. The map became wild and
Zaz.
but the sweetest gift. And I think this is very tethered to what I was invoking there with my mother and those moments. So quietly, while you were asleep, the moon and I were talking. I asked that she'd always keep you protected. She promised you her light, that you so gracefully carry. You bring your light and shine like morning. And then the wind pulls the clouds across the moon. Your light fills the darkest room. And I can see the miracle that keeps us from falling. She promised all the sweetest gifts that only the heavens could bestow. You bring your light and shine like morning. And as you so gracefully give her light, as long as you live, I'll always remember this moment.
I think Sade also exists in my head and in my heart and in my body and in my ears as a deeply beautiful, singular voice. And also a voice navigating Africanness and empire and the wide yawn of the Atlantic in such a really gorgeous way, in an embodied way, as a gorgeous human being with a gorgeous voice. So thank you for reading that. It's nice now because we can actually get into a poet who I feel has laid her hands on both of our work in such incredibly world-changing ways, world-altering ways, world-opening ways. Habiba Badrin, for me, was the first time I encountered the work of a femme poet who spoke frankly about war, and who seems to invoke a voice of history that does not sound removed from people, that feels deeply housed inside of the body. Yeah. Can you tell me about your encounters with Habiba and how she made her way into Beloved?
And just a note, I mean, it's when I was thinking about Habiba, I was really thinking about your practice and how so much of it is felt in the body. So I love that you said that.
I learned it from her.
But yes, intimacy. I think with someone like Habiba, in that sort of deep dive into her, it's a black feminist praxis, which guides us to think about beauty as something that can be enacted in the quotidian, as a strategy for others. And so someone like Habiba really gets me thinking carefully about that. I'm so struck by the intimacy of her work and the ways in which she transports and locates her reader within such an intimate encounter. I'm going to also cite Habiba. This is my last citation for the day. It doesn't come from one of her poems, but it comes from an essay that she wrote for the Visual Century readers on South African art. And her chapter is called Intimacy and History, the Art of Difference and Identity in South Africa. I find this really important in terms of thinking about intimacy, looking, presencing, being, and this is something you might want to take with you in your encounter with Beloved. But I think that Habiba really gives us a way to try and come to one another in forms of relationality that doesn't necessarily collapse those differences but holds them, which is hard work because it's difference that has our world on fire right now. So I have learned that intimacy has an intellectual weight. This is Habiba, not me. In contrast to the instinctive flash of knowledge about skin color that South Africans have inherited from 350 years of colonialism, intimacy operates at a slower pace. Isn't that beautiful? Intimacy operates at a slower pace, which I think is so important because, right, we also live in an incredibly difficult country. It draws us into thinking beyond what we know. It questions obvious differences, but has a clear-eyed skepticism for the seduction of easy affiliations. It proposes that identities emerge within history, but are also mobile. I like that. Their signs manifest in physical, but also subtle and interior, and their possibilities radically open. It asks us to stand close to the thing itself. So I ask you to stand close to those works in there. Close to the thing itself, to think about form, about the past, about black and white, and everything suspended in between.
I want to give my own citation, and there'll be two of them, one by Gabrielle Goliath, and then the kind of bookend of the conversation, because we opened up with George Abraham, and I wanted to close with George too. But before I start with the two poems, is there anything else that you want to say? Because I think I'm going to say my poems and I'm going to be done talking because I've been blah, blah, blah.
I think this is the first time I've ever heard you say you've been done talking. Is that, yeah.
Very rare.
Very rare.
Very rare for me. But yes, I think in my millennial way, I want to read a piece by Gabrielle Goliath called War Triptych, Love, Silence, and Glory, that feels particularly resonant right now. So yeah. 1. Always for the first time. We tell our stories of war like stories of love, innocent as eggs. We will meet memory again at the wall around our city, always for the first time. 2. Accounting. The mother asked to stay. She looked at her silent child. I was waiting for you. The quiet of the girl's face was a different quiet. Her hands lay untouched by death. The washer of bodies cut away her long black dress. Blue prayer beads fell to the floor in a slow accounting. The washer of bodies began to sing a prayer to mothers and daughters. The mother said, "Who will wait for me?" On the aftermath of the bombings on the Holy Day in Iraq. 3. A father receives news of his son who died in the Intifada. When he heard the news, Mr. Karim became silent. He did not look at the cameras, nor at the people who brought their grief. He held a hand, he felt a hand slip from his hand, a small unclasping. And for that, he refused the solace of glory. Last one. This is a really beautiful poem called Taking Back Jerusalem by George Abraham. Let me be brief. By the end of this, someone will be cursed, and I pray it anyone but him. Let me start again. The night was beautiful, but not romantic. Sure, there was smoke and moonlight. From this angle, you could almost mistake the city for American. There were 7, all of us born of this country before this country existed. It was ours, the way a street cat is mothered back. The sign reading cameras in use outside an unlit jewelry store, the palm trees dancing like they could belong there. City of gravel throat and temples cry, of gold-blessed forehead and confluenced histories. How many waters anointed and claimed you inheritance? How many hands unsanctuaried you by birthright and conquest? A name, however holy, can be a story of unimaginable distance. We could only exit you by the mouth through which we had entered, and there we first saw him. Shadow folded in shadow, speaking hushed and hurried Arabic, and for the first time that night, a familiar I could but couldn't have known, a boy with moonlit tongue, promising his mother he'll make it. Back with every breath, peering around the corner, a soldier, his gun, that precise smallness. I couldn't unsee him or him. Couldn't uncast that smile from his nodding face, our mouths pretty with English. He stopped one of us. He searched only one of us. And there I remembered my mother begging God to watch over us in Jerusalem, where at 4 years old a soldier held a gun to her head. And maybe it was, or wasn't, at this exact spot. Or maybe she prayed for the wrong son, but in that moment I prayed. And there was no God but the space between us. How the distance between my holy and his holy could resurrect a broken Lord on my breath. And there I began to understand how my mother could abandon her birthright. And I suppose she made it out alive, depending on your frame of reference. And so did we. And by some magic, so did that boy, caught with the wrong God on his breath in his holy city. Forgive me. Forgive me. I'm trying to understand what makes one's existence at a fixed location a radical act, divine even, and what makes the existence of another near a specific body of water a violence. Forgive me. I wrote this in an American airport, and its magic escaped me. Thank you so much to everyone in this room. Thank you to the wonderful folks at the Goodman, to the incredible people at the RGC, and to my incredible interlocutor, Gabrielle Goliath. It was a privilege of a lifetime to sit and talk to you like this. I could talk to you forever, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Maneo. I could tell that I'm still blushing very deeply. Words do not suffice in this moment. And as I said, I'm learning alongside somebody who is incredibly extraordinary. I think you would all... I find Maneo to be a very life-giving person. So I'll end there. Thank you.